Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we're talking with Shirin Bridges, author and publisher. She believes that girls can do anything they set their minds to, and that is the basis for her creation of Goosebottom books. Its first series, when launched in 2010, The Thinking Girl's Treasury of Real Princesses, was Shirin's 7 middle-grade titles. Today, Shirin has published 19 books in several series, as well as created a fiction imprint. Goosebottom authors now number 7, and Shirin's publishing team includes 2 editors in addition to Shirin, 2 copy editors, and 3 illustrators. Before her publishing venture, Bridges was creative director in advertising for 20 years. She says, "Most of my writing is about girls who manage to do what few people think is possible." The princesses in her Thinking Girls series, who are from around the world, all had to overcome barriers in order to achieve their goals. Today, Goosebottom distributes its books through Perseus, America's largest book distributor, recently acquired by Ingram, which is America's largest book wholesaler. Welcome, Shirin.
Thank you.
That's quite a bio, and I didn't, until I just read this today, think of the difference between America's largest book distributor and America's largest book wholesaler. It sounds kind of exciting that those two are now united. But what I'm very interested in establishing before we talk further is your connection to the Pacific Northwest.
I am the great-great-great-granddaughter of a gentleman named Chen Chin-ho, who was the first Chinese resident of Seattle, and his residency was recorded in the 1860 census. He was a merchant and a labor contractor, and the premises of his last store, which was the Wachong Company, their last premises is now the location of the Wing Luk Museum of Asian History in Seattle.
Wow. Did you grow up knowing this history?
No, we grew up knowing that one of my grandmother's great-grandfather was in the States and that he came over as a domestic servant and then kind of made it rich somewhere. We were very vague on exactly where. And that he married a Native American woman and actually brought her home to China. And there was a lot of kind of family lore around that marriage and that woman. But the details about him weren't very clear to me or to my immediate family. It's a very large family, so we have second and third cousins who have been tracking him down and, accumulating all this history for a long time. But our branch of the family wasn't so aware of it.
How has it changed your life to know this information, and especially about the museum and the location and his success?
It's interesting because the little bit I knew about the family lore about his wife, his Native American wife, made me really interested, not so much in a nonfiction kind of way, but as a fiction writer. It made me very interested in the thought that someone from this part of the world who would travel all the way to China in the 1860s, and that kind of boggled my mind, how you would do that and what it would have been like, and the fact that she wouldn't have had the language, that the Chinese kind of xenophobic at the best of times, and the part of China that she went to was very rural and very remote, and also very, very poor. And I spent a lot of time just wondering what that story would have been like. And it was actually in trying to research that story for a novel that I'm writing now that I started to unearth the reality behind her husband, who is much better documented because he was such a well-known and well-established person in the Seattle community. So it's been really kind of interesting to uncover him bit by bit, even as I'm trying to pursue the kind of like remnants of her and her life. There's a lot less recorded about her, unfortunately, so I have to research him to give her proper context.
Wow. So do you come up to the Northwest, and you're based in California, do you come up to the Northwest to do that research?
Yes, I think in the beginning of, not this year, but last year, I actually rented a cottage to come up for 3 months. I gave myself 3 months, kind of cleared my schedule, gave myself 3 months to do the bulk of the research for this novel. And then a strange thing happened. I was going to station myself on Bainbridge Island, being halfway between the Seattle Public Library and all the museums in Seattle, and also the Suquamish Museum in Suquamish. And as I'm doing the search to find myself a little writer's nook, I end up falling in love with this cottage in Port Orchard. And I thought, well, it adds an extra hour commute time in both directions, whatever. But it's a really charming cottage, and it feels right to me, so I'm going to do that. Well, the first day that I was in Seattle Public, I went to meet with the genealogy librarian, and he said to me, okay, well, we'll see what we can help you with. First thing that he brought up was, he said, oh, isn't this interesting? They used to live in Port Orchard, and they had their sons there. So it was really strange to me that I ended up in Port Orchard, and I knew nothing about Port Orchard, and that was, in fact, where they had their family home. And since then, I've been able to find exactly where, like which piece of land they lived on. And
that's remarkable.
There are some little things that make this, I don't want to sound too superstitious, but it makes this novel feel kind of destined and haunted, as if it's meant to be written. Little things fall into my lap all the time.
That's fabulous. The synchronicity of being a writer is I think many of us feel that happens, but this is an extraordinary story. So in keeping with your interest in girls being able to do other things that other people don't even think are possible, it's kind of like that with the Native American wife who goes to China. I bet that idea about women might be infiltrating your ideas about her. Do you think so?
Yeah. I think that I have always been, by nature, just more drawn to those stories. And it's not a very conscious decision. When I was young, I used to read a lot of history and biography, and I was especially fascinated by the biography of women who had managed to achieve some kind of autonomy in the 3,000-odd years where that was a very difficult thing to do. And that's reflected in my publishing, of course. We published a series on real princesses, about princesses who kind of managed to exert themselves and change history and do some very unusual things. You sometimes hear responses from the public, oh, well, don't you think to a large extent that was facilitated by the fact that they're princesses? But what I usually point out is, yes, but there were many, many princesses, and very few of them did anything. So the fact that they were princesses, yes, I'm sure that we would have heard much less about someone with less power, but that they took any power at all is still noteworthy.
Absolutely.
And so our second series is the same kind of concept. We're looking then at the dastardly dames, and these are women who earned very bad reputations in their own lifetimes. And it's a re-examination of why that might be. And even if they're not perfect women, and none of them are, it's kind of interesting to me, and I think important for our children to know, that they nevertheless managed to exert power at a time when it was all but precluded.
Can you give us an example of who one or two of these women are?
Well, from the dames, for example, I wrote the volume about Agrippina. She was called in her time atrocious and ferocious. That's how Tacitus, the historian, refers to her. She was the sister of Caligula, the wife of Claudius, and the mother of Nero. And when she was alive, the Romans used to hate her, in part because she assumed so much power. They thought that was just against the rules of nature, that women should be, I was going to say seen but not heard, but they thought actually women shouldn't even be seen once you're married. So there was a great deal of resentment about the fact that she took so much power, and she had this reputation of being atrocious and ferocious. There is evidence to implicate her in a few murders. There was a lot of murdering going on in ancient Rome in those days. But if you also look at the record of, for example, how many trials were closed-door trials and how many were done openly in front of the Senate during her time, she actually had a moderating influence on all three men. So that when she passed away, Nero actually went from being abysmal to atrocious. And Claudius seems to have respected her greatly, actually gave her equal billing with him. They actually minted coins during his reign where her head was on one side and his head was on the other, and the two heads were the same size. There was also a very famous incident where they were actually accepting the capitulation of the Britons, the Roman conquest of Britain. And when it came to accepting that tribute, they both sat on daises that were of the same height. So the Romans took all this kind of symbolism very, very seriously. And the fact that her husband, the emperor, accorded her this kind of honor was just, now in our days, looking back, I'm so excited that she managed to achieve this, and she must have achieved it out of respect from that husband. But in those days, it was just seen as an abysmal and horrible thing, and what's the word for it? Just like an overturn of the natural way, right. and how things should be.
So this is a harrowing story in many ways, and this also is for middle grade readers?
This is for middle grade readers. Yeah.
All right. So I was wondering if you'd like to read from any of the books that are from your press that interest you at the moment for sharing with us.
Well, I'd love to read to you just the introduction and the exit of Agrippina. And the reason why, apart from the fact that I actually think this is a very interesting story, the reason why I'd like to do it too is because one of the things that we wanted to do with Goosebottom is to convince kids that history can be absolutely fascinating, and it can read in a way that's as exciting and as compelling as any piece of fiction. I think that there's a perception out there that if you're reading history, that's a textbook and that's going to be boring and dry and horrible. So hopefully my two little excerpts here will convince any young listeners that history is actually worth giving a read, that so many things happened in real life that we novelists, and I write fiction as well as nonfiction, so I know this to be true, that we could only dare to encompass in our plot lines. So, Agrippina, atrocious and ferocious. It is a clear night in the year 59. A woman sits looking out at the road approaching her imposing seaside villa. Her name is Agrippina. The proud tilt of her chin reflects her status as a great-granddaughter of Augustus, the first Roman emperor. As a sister of the Emperor Caligula and then wife of the Emperor Claudius, she has been highly honored, even deified, declared a goddess. But now, to the small group of people watching her villa from the side of the road, she is a monster. They believe that she has poisoned her husbands, sent soldiers to bring back the heads of her enemies, and done other unspeakable things. She knows that they will not help her now, and as dust rises on the road announcing the approach of soldiers, they melt away into the shadows. Agrippina will have to face her murderers alone. So the book goes from that opening introduction into the retelling of her history, of her biography, and then we end the book on a last word, which is, Agrippina watches the dust rise over the road. She can hear the clomp-clomp of hobnailed boots. She narrowly escaped a near drowning only hours earlier. She'd been returning by boat after dining with Nero when something had gone wrong. In the confusion, she'd found herself flung into the water. Any hope that this had been an accident disappeared when she found herself being battered by oars on the head and arms as she surfaced. The sailors had tried to kill her, but she had managed to swim back to shore. Now, she knows, they are coming to finish their work, and she knows it is her own son who has sent them. She hears a step behind her, sees light running down a blade as the sword is drawn. Turning, she draws herself to her full height. Erect with the ferocious arrogance that has caused so much resentment, she raises her robes and bares her stomach. Strike the womb that bore Nero, she commands.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend. In case you just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, Sheila is talking to California-based writer Shirin Bridges about her writing in Goosebottom Books, her press for middle grade books.
Is that the ending?
That's the ending.
Oh, my goodness. She is ferocious and brave, and it's a sad ending. So, well, you certainly made history sound compelling and interesting. How do you feel about ending a book like that for middle grade readers? Is there any rule about being more cheerful?
If there's a rule, I'm not following it.
Right.
Yeah, no. One of the privileges of being a publisher is that you get to decide what your ideals are. And my ideals when it comes to knowledge and reading and exposure for children, especially about history, is that although I don't try and cram anything too upsetting down their throats, I also don't believe in shirking from what happened. I think that there's this kind of a double standard when it comes to men and women. I don't think a lot of people will not question that children will need to learn at some stage about characters in history, like Genghis Khan is very popular. You know, when I go out and read and speak to students, I'll just take a quick survey. Who's heard of Genghis Khan? And all these hands shoot up. And who's heard of Adolf Hitler? And almost all of them have heard of Hitler. Stalin, Attila the Hun, whoever. And so we're not very shy about teaching our kids about bad men and the bad things that bad men did, as long as it's in this historical context and without being too sensationalist, of course. But as soon as it's a woman, it's very, very interesting. We're still in a U.S. that is very, very squeamish about exposing the dastardly and the dastardly dames. I was interviewed on NPR, and there was a big comment thread about that. Like, children should be exposed to these stories because these women were such bad role models. And as a publisher, I think that for the same reason that children should be exposed to bad male role models, as long as we are quite clear that they are bad, we should be doing the same thing about women.
But as you said, this woman was not all bad. She managed to do some...
Yes,
yeah.
She's not all bad. And this age, you know, middle grade, 9 to 13, are some very formative years, and they're really not that young. Like, some of the things that they're thinking about and discussing with their peers, how the world works, is very, very kind of important to them. You know, when they get into their teenage years, I think that they sometimes have their, if anything, more internal facing. I'm watching two nieces right now. One is she's 16, so she's in YA land by now. And the other one is still squarely in MG land. And it's really interesting for me as an author to watch them and to see what they think about and what they talk about and what they're trying to work out about the world around them. So I think actually 9 to 13 is a really good time to kind of expose them to the fact through stories like these that there are all these nuances of how power has not been shared, how things have not been fair, how even when you're vilified, these are still human beings and they're still complex. And that, yes, Agrippina managed to do some good things, but even if she had not, I think that you would still admire the way that she died. You know, it's undeniable that this woman had courage and she had determination and she had strength of will in a time when all of those things just, if you had it, it was really hard to exercise any of it.
If you were female, so. Yeah. Is this book, like many of the others, or maybe all of them in your series, illustrated?
Yes, they're all illustrated. The idea was that I'm trying to make history palatable. So in addition to have that very strong kind of narrative beginning that actually leads you into each book before you get into some more factual portion of the book, we use a lot of illustration. So we actually use illustration in the picture book sense, where we have an illustrator for each series that kind of unites the look and feel of the series together with that particular illustration style. And the illustrator will do maybe 3 or 4 scenes out of the story and illustrate them as like picture book illustrations. But in addition to that, we use a lot of photography, archival images. We have in all the books sections, sidebars that give you context for what you're reading. So you always find out, for example, you know, what she would have eaten, like what she ate, what she wore, how she lived. So we pick out sections like that, and you'll see lots and lots of inset photographs scattered all through the text that show you interesting little snippets of what we're talking about. It makes the books really rich, and I'm very proud of the Dames especially. I think is an especially beautiful series, and it works really well with those little clippets of visual information as you go through.
Right. It sounds very enriching, very, very much so, and the amount of research that goes into that sounds extraordinary too.
I've been really pleased by the fact that despite initial concerns and some pushback about doing a Treasury of Dastardly Dames, everybody was so automatically enthused about princesses, especially with the concern about Disney princesses kidnapping everybody's 6-year-olds. There was a lot of enthusiasm for the idea of a series of real princesses, and it came directly out of my experience again with my nieces, where actually the 16-year-old now was at that time maybe 6 or 7, very, very bright and independent, and she got distracted by the Disney princesses. And I said to her, hey, you know there were real princesses out there who did remarkable things, right? And she didn't know, so we agreed it would be fun to go find them. And I happen to know them because I'm just a history buff, and I have been all my life. But when we actually went looking for them, we couldn't find them, not in bookstores, not in the library. And that's when I decided I'd have to write that series and get it out there. And at first I was going to just write them and have worked with several publishers in the course of my writing career, so I was going to have a favorite publisher publish them if they were interested. And then I got into the project a little way and decided that I wanted to publish them myself. It's very hard for a mainstream publisher to bring out an entire series at one time. It makes much more sense to test like one book and see how that goes, and if it goes well, introduce more books. But I wanted to come out with a series right from the beginning because that communicates a different message. That says that you're looking here at women across many, many cultures and across many, many epochs of history who have been able to do this, who have been able to exert themselves and make the most of their lives, and who didn't sit around waiting for a prince. And it's a pattern, and you can be part of this pattern.
I want to say you're certainly an example of that by taking on something that even the major publishers would not take on. So you are a living role model for what you are putting into the stories about the princesses, and I really appreciate hearing that background of yours and the connection with your niece and what you felt she needed to learn about, and then just thinking, well, it doesn't make sense to not have the whole series, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. So you are ferocious. I want to ask you about something you're, in addition to writing and researching and publishing and speaking, and I know teaching, you've also just taken a position as the executive director of the Mendocino Coast Writers Conference.
The Mendocino Coast Writers Conference.
So, and that's very new. I mean, the conference is not new to you. It's where I met you, in fact, one year when I was lucky enough to be asked to teach there. But what does that add to your agenda and your life?
It's adding a lot of responsibility, and I actually thought about it very carefully before I took it. And then it just got to a point where it just felt like the right thing to do, and that it had to be done.
Another one of your role model examples.
Yes, very scary at this moment.
Is it?
But I think it's a great opportunity. I worked for many years in advertising as a creative director and was in management too as a senior vice president. So I'm excited because this is a creative project. This is leading a team trying to present something creatively and freshly and reinvented every year to be like better and bigger than the year before. And so it's got a lot of challenges in it. And as you may have guessed, I actually like challenges.
I think I guessed that. And I want to say my experience of teaching, and I actually did teach for Mendocino Coast Writers Conference twice, once quite a while ago when my first book on writing came out, and then the year before the summer. It is a very special conference, and the fact that so many people are enthused about the idea of making it what you called better and better each year and interesting, I think it has a track record, and people can find that conference.
It's mcwc.org.
Okay.
One of the first things that I'm doing is that we're going to be relaunching that website and rebranding ourselves. So right now, apologies to everyone out there, right now it's a little hard to get the information you might be looking for, but as Ginny Vorbury, our new president, just said, we will look very gorgeous very soon.
That's nice. And that brings me to the fact that I should also tell our listeners how to find the books and series that you've been talking about from Goosebottom.
It's goosebottombooks.com.
Aha, goosebottombooks.com.
Yeah.
And before we end our conversation today, I think I need to ask you where that name came from.
Well, seeing as you have primarily an adult audience, I will tell the adult version, which is that I had a French-speaking boyfriend who used to call me cul d'oie, which is it means the goose's ass, and it's kind of like it's teasing. It's affectionate, but it's teasing, that you're kind of bossy or something. So then I changed that to Goosebottom in its English and child-friendly translation. I also liked it because goose, when you're in children's literature, has long legs because of Mother Goose and all these connotations. But then the bottom makes it a bit cheeky, and if you ever see our logo, you see that it's cheekier yet, because in the little goose bottom that's shown as part of our logo, we actually placed what could either be a miscolored feather, but a little item of anatomy, and kids love it. Every time I go and speak in schools, and we usually give out postcards and bookmarks, the kids will come up and actually say, "We love your name and we love your logo, and this is so funny." And
I think that it's certainly very, very memorable. And it does bring a smile. I tell people about you and your press, Goosebottom, and they go, immediately smile and say, Goosebottom? Yeah. So it's something not to be forgotten, as are the subjects of your series. So we have to end today, but I want to thank you so much for telling us about your connection to the Northwest, the project you're working on researching the Native American woman who married your great-great-great-grandfather, and all the work that you're doing to encourage writers and readers, and especially the work you're doing to encourage young girls to take on the world, as you have. So thank you very, very much, Shirin.
Thank you so much for inviting me for this chat.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.